veteran James Barnes retreated to a remote cabin on a mountaintop to bury the past. He believed he had cut all ties with the world, but on a stormy night, an uninvited guest collapsed at his doorstep. It was a large German shepherd, bearing not a wound from a wild animal, but a bullet wound. James's military medic experience told him this was a deliberate, targeted hit, and when he discovered the strange object cleverly hidden inside its collar, he understood that this dog wasn't just fleeing from death. It was carrying a deadly secret, a secret that could destroy the most powerful people. And now, it had laid that secret right at his feet. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The sun had not yet breached the jagged spine of the Blue Ridge Mountains, but James Barnes was already awake. He moved with the quiet economy of a man long accustomed to solitude, his bare feet making no sound on the cool, worn floorboards of the cabin. The mountain air, crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth, seeped through the window he always left cracked open, a silent testament to a vigilance that never truly slept. James was a man carved from the very highlands he inhabited. At 42 years old, he had the lean, hard-muscled frame that years of military service had built and a life of manual labor had maintained. His short brown hair was trimmed with disciplined precision, though strands of silver now staked their claim at his temples, a quiet map of the years since he had left the world behind. His face was a study in contradictions. The sharp line of his jaw and the weathered texture of his skin spoke of hardship. Yet his eyes, a deep and thoughtful gray, held a profound and weary kindness. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and felt too deeply. His routine was a ritual, a bulwark against the chaos that churned just beneath the surface of his calm. Coffee first, black and strong, brewed in an old percolator on the gas stove. He would stand by the large window in the main room, sipping the hot liquid as the sky slowly bled from inky black to a soft, bruised purple. He watched the forest wake up, the birds beginning their chorus, a deer and its fawn stepping delicately through the morning mist. This place was both his sanctuary and his prison. From this vantage point, the world was a masterpiece of silent, indifferent beauty. Endless waves of forested peaks rolled into the distance, their slopes a tapestry of green and granite. The cabin, which he had built with his own hands, was perched on a high bluff, a solitary outpost against the vastness of the sky and the ancient wilderness. He had come here 6 years ago, after the accident in the rainy autumn of 2019. He had come here to bury the man he used to be, the husband of Sarah, the father of Lily. But ghosts did not care for geography. They had followed him up the winding mountain roads, settling into the quiet corners of the cabin, their whispers carried on the wind that sighed through the towering hemlocks. After his coffee, James would begin his patrol. He'd pull on a faded gray t-shirt, a worn flannel shirt in shades of navy and beige left unbuttoned, and a pair of denim jeans softened by years of wear. His feet found their home in a pair of sturdy work boots. He never went outside unarmed. A pistol was holstered securely at his hip, a habit so ingrained it felt like a part of his own body. He would walk the perimeter of his property, his steps measured, his senses on high alert. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was simply obeying a command from a part of his mind that still stood on guard duty, a lonely sentry watching over a life that had already been lost. The memories came in flashes, sharp and unwelcome as shards of glass. The slick blacktop of the road, gleaming under the streetlights. The squeal of tires that he could still hear in the dead of night. The impossible, final silence. He would stop walking then, his hand tightening on the grip of his pistol, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle would tick beneath his skin. He would force himself to breathe, to focus on the world in front of him, the texture of bark on an old oak, the call of a distant hawk. the feeling of the solid ground beneath his boots. He would cage the memories, lock them away again in the dark. But he knew they were always there, waiting. This land, in its rugged splendor, was the only thing vast enough to contain his grief. He had chosen it for its isolation, for its silence that allowed him to hear nothing but the beating of his own broken heart. It was a place where no one could reach him, where no unexpected phone calls or well-meaning visitors could pierce the armor he had built around himself. It was a good place to disappear, to become a ghost among the peaks. But sometimes, when the loneliness grew too sharp, he understood that this beautiful, wild place was not a refuge. It was a tomb, and he was its willing caretaker. That afternoon, the sky began to change. The clear, bright blue of the morning curdled into a bruised, heavy gray. The wind picked up, its mournful sigh turning into a restless howl that whipped through the trees, tearing at their leaves. James watched the storm roll in from his porch, his chair creaking rhythmically. Storms didn't bother him. He respected their power, their raw and honest fury. It was a language he understood. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, he moved inside, securing the windows and door. The rain quickly became a deluge, lashing against the cabin in violent sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening explosion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. Lightning bleached the world white for a split second, illuminating the thrashing trees and the chaos of the storm. He was stoking the fire in the stone hearth, the crackle of the flames a small comfort against the roar of the tempest, when he heard it. A sound that did not belong. It was not the crash of thunder or the groan of a tree branch. It was a heavy, desperate thud against his front door. James froze, every instinct honed by years of training snapping to attention. He straightened up slowly, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. No one came to this cabin. No one. A hunter, perhaps, lost in the storm? Unlikely. Any local knew better than to be caught out on these ridges in weather like this. Another thud, weaker this time, followed by what sounded like a low whine, almost swallowed by the wind. It was an animal. Relief warred with caution. He moved to the door, his steps silent, and peered through the small peephole. All he could see was a wall of driving rain and darkness. He undid the heavy deadbolt, his pistol now drawn and held low at his side. He opened the door a few inches, the wind tearing it from his grasp and slamming it open against the interior wall. And there, collapsed on his doorstep, was a creature of shadow and storm. It was a German shepherd, massive and powerfully built, its thick coat a rare and beautiful mix of slate gray and startling white fur. The dog was soaked, its fur matted with mud, and something darker that James knew was not rain. It lay on its side, breathing in shallow, ragged pants. Its eyes were open, intelligent and amber-colored, and they were fixed on him with a look of desperate, fading urgency. Along its flank, just below the ribcage, a dark patch of fur was unnaturally wet, the unmistakable sign of a gunshot wound. The magnificent animal let out one last soft cry before its head fell limp against the wet wood of the porch. For a man who had spent 6 years shutting the world out, the act of dragging it inside was a brutal, physical shock. The German shepherd was a dead weight, 100 pounds of unconscious muscle and wet fur. James Barnes gritted his teeth, his own muscles straining as he pulled the animal over the threshold and slammed the door against the storm's fury. The sudden quiet in the cabin was heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the hearth, the howl of the wind outside, and the shallow, labored breathing of the dog. James was no stranger to triage. He had performed it under far worse conditions, in the dust and chaos of places he tried not to remember. His training took over, a familiar and cold comfort. He laid an old wool blanket on the floorboards before the fire
and carefully rolled the dog onto it. The firelight flickered across the animal's gray and white coat, revealing the true extent of the wound.
It was a clean entry, but the exit was ragged, and the dog had lost a significant amount of blood. "All right, let's see what we're dealing with," James murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He retrieved his medical kit from a large footlocker at the end of his bed. It was military issue, meticulously maintained. Inside, sterile instruments lay in perfect order. He worked with a focused intensity, the rest of the world fading away until it was just him, the dog, and the wound. He cleaned the area with antiseptic, his touch surprisingly gentle. The dog didn't stir, lost in a deep state of shock. As he irrigated the exit wound, his fingers brushed against something hard lodged beneath the skin. A fragment. He worked carefully with a pair of forceps, probing the torn tissue. A few moments later, he pulled it free. It was a piece of deformed metal, the jacket peeled back from the lead core. He dropped it into a small metal bowl, where it made a sharp clinking sound. He knew ballistics. This was no hunting round. It was a small-caliber rifle bullet, the kind favored for its low report, often paired with a suppressor. It was a round designed for quiet, efficient killing, not for taking down game. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in his gut. This was not a lost dog accidentally shot by a poacher. This was something else entirely. This was deliberate. He finished dressing the wound, wrapping the dog's torso with clean bandages. He administered a broad-spectrum antibiotic from his own supply and set up a slow drip of saline to combat the dehydration and shock. As he worked, he studied the animal. It was in prime condition, no older than 4 or 5. Its muscles were well defined, its teeth clean, its coat thick and cared for. This was not a stray. This dog had a home, a purpose. It had the calm, confident bearing of a creature that knew its own strength. Even unconscious, it projected an aura of unwavering resilience. "You're a tough one," James said, more to himself than to the dog. "Like a rock." The name settled in his mind as if it had always been there. Rocky. With the immediate medical crisis handled, James's professional vigilance fully awakened. He let his eyes roam over the dog again, looking for anything else out of place. His gaze fell on the collar. It was thick, made of high-quality black nylon with a sturdy metal buckle. Not the kind of thing you buy at a chain pet store. He ran his fingers along it, feeling the texture. Underneath the main strap, in the padded section designed for comfort, his thumb detected a small hard lump that didn't belong. He retrieved a small utility knife from his pocket. With surgical precision, he sliced through the heavy stitching of the collar's lining. He pulled the fabric back and found a tiny, sealed plastic pouch nestled within the padding. Inside the pouch was a single object, a matte black USB drive, small and ruggedized. James stared at it, the small device resting in the palm of his hand. The cold knot of suspicion in his stomach solidified into a certainty as hard and heavy as granite. This was no accident. The dog was not a victim. He was a messenger. And the message he carried was important enough for someone to try to kill him over. James looked from the drive to the dog, whose life now seemed inextricably linked to his own. The quiet, empty fortress he had built for himself had just been breached by a silent courier. He spent the next few hours watching over his patient. The storm outside eventually exhausted its fury, the thunder receding into a distant grumble, the rain softening to a steady drizzle. Inside, the only sounds were the fire and Rocky's breathing, which was slowly growing deeper and more regular. Around midnight, the dog stirred. Its amber eyes fluttered open, hazy at first, then sharpening with a startling intelligence. It tried to lift its head, then whimpered softly as the pain in its side flared. "Easy now," James said, his voice low and calm. He held out a bowl of fresh water. Rocky lapped at it eagerly, his thirst immense. When he was done, he looked at James, not with the fear of a wild animal, but with a clear, assessing gaze. There was a moment of silent communication, a mutual understanding that passed between the wounded soldier and the wounded animal. After another hour of rest, Rocky struggled to his feet. He was unsteady, his legs trembling with weakness, but he was resolute. He took a few steps, testing his balance. Then, he walked directly to James, who was sitting in his armchair, and nudged his hand with his wet nose. It was a gentle but firm gesture. When he had James's attention, he turned, walked to the front door, and stood before it, looking back over his shoulder. He let out a low whine, a sound filled not with pain, but with a profound, undeniable urgency. The message was perfectly clear. It's time to go. James looked at the dog standing sentinel by the door. He looked at the small USB drive now sitting on the table beside him. He could ignore it. He could tend to the dog until it was healed and then let it go on its way. He could bolt the door, reinforce his walls, and sink back into the quiet oblivion he had chosen. It would be the safe thing to do, the sensible thing. But as he looked into the dog's intelligent, pleading eyes, he saw a reflection of a duty he thought he had buried long ago. The man who followed orders, the man who ran toward trouble, not away from it, was still in there. He had tried to silence him, but he had never truly killed him. With a deep sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 6 years of solitude, James Barnes stood up. He walked to the footlocker, the one that held more than just medical supplies. He pulled out a tactical backpack, a GPS unit, and a high-powered rifle. The ghost of the mountain was about to walk back into the world, and he would not be walking alone. Dawn broke over a world washed clean. The air, stripped of humidity by the storm, was sharp and cool in James Barnes's lungs. Mist clung to the hollows of the mountains, ghostly white against the deep green of the pines. Armed and packed, he stood on his porch and looked at his guide. Rocky was waiting, his posture alert. The bandages around his torso were clean, but James knew the dog was in pain. Yet, there was no hesitation in his amber eyes, only a focused, driving purpose. He gave a single, low woof, as if to say, "The trail is already getting cold." James nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their shared mission. He locked the cabin door, a place that had been his entire world for 6 years, and stepped back into the life he had tried so hard to outrun. The journey was grueling. The storm had left the forest floor a treacherous landscape of slick mud, fallen branches, and swollen, fast-moving creeks. Rocky led them on a path that no human would have chosen, a direct and difficult route that cut through dense thickets and up steep, rocky inclines. The dog moved with an incredible, intelligent resolve. He would pause at forks in the barely there trail, sniff the air, and then choose a direction with unwavering confidence. He never looked back to see if James was following. He simply knew. Several times they had to stop so James could check Rocky's wound and give him water. The dog accepted the care with a quiet patience, but as soon as James was done, he would be on his feet again, eager to continue. A deep, unspoken respect grew between them. James recognized the heart of a good soldier in this animal, disciplined, determined, and utterly loyal to his task. After nearly 3 hours of hard trekking, Rocky slowed. They were on a high ridge overlooking a small, secluded valley. The dog let out a low whine and nudged James's leg, his gaze fixed on a point below. James lifted his binoculars. Nestled in a clearing, half swallowed by overgrown rhododendrons, was a dilapidated structure. An old ranger station, long since abandoned by the Park Service. Its paint was peeling, and a shutter hung crookedly from a single hinge. It looked like a place the world had forgotten. It was the perfect place to hide. James approached the station with the caution of a man walking into an ambush. He left Rocky hidden in the tree line, a silent command passing between them, and circled the building. There were no fresh tracks, but his instincts told him the place was not empty. The air was still, heavy with a feeling of tense, frightened waiting. He found a back window that had been pried open. It was the only viable entry point besides the barricaded front door. He slipped through the window, landing in a crouch on the dusty floor inside. The station was dark, smelling of mildew and decay. He moved through the rooms like a wraith, his rifle held at the ready. In the main office, he found signs of recent occupation. Empty water bottles, a few discarded food wrappers, and a small, threadbare blanket. He heard a faint rustle from a back storage room. He approached the door, his heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. He pushed it open. Huddled in the far corner were a woman and a young boy. The woman looked up, her eyes wide with terror in the dim light. She was in her late 30s, with dark tangled hair framing a face that was gaunt with exhaustion and fear. She wore practical hiking clothes that were now torn and mud-stained. In her hands, she clutched a heavy iron tire iron, holding it like a weapon. Shielded behind her was a small boy, no older than 8, with wide dark eyes that seemed to see nothing at all. He clung to his mother's leg, a silent, ghost-like figure. "Don't come any closer," the woman warned, her voice a harsh, desperate whisper. James held up his free hand, keeping the rifle pointed at the floor. "I'm not going to hurt you. The dog led me here." At the mention of the dog, a flicker of something, hope perhaps, crossed her face. But it was quickly replaced by suspicion. "Who are you?" He took a half step into the room, allowing a sliver of light from a grimy window to fall across his features. The woman's breath hitched, her eyes darted from his face to some point in her memory and back again. The tire iron lowered slightly. "I've seen you," she stammered. "In a photograph. On David's desk." She took a shaky breath, her voice cracking as she spoke the name. "You're James Barnes." The name of her husband hit James with the force of a physical blow. David Carson. The name echoed from a lifetime ago, from a world of sand and sweat and brotherhood forged in fire. David, his teammate in the Marines, the man who had been the closest thing to a brother he'd ever had, the man he hadn't spoken to in nearly 7 years. "You're Rachel?" he asked, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. She nodded, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her dirt-streaked cheeks. The tire iron fell to the floor with a loud clang. "He's gone, James," she sobbed, her body racked with grief. "They killed him." He moved forward then, his own loss a fresh, open wound in his chest. He helped her to a sitting position on an overturned crate. The boy Carl never made a sound. He simply watched, his expression chillingly blank. In hushed, frantic tones, Rachel told him everything. David had become an investigative journalist after leaving the service. He had uncovered something massive, a criminal enterprise run by a powerful man. They were preparing to publish when the trap was sprung. They were ambushed on a remote road 2 days ago. "David knew this might happen," she explained, her voice trembling. "He had a contingency plan, a last resort. He told me if the worst happened, he would get Rocky to you. He said you were the only one he could trust." She described their last moments together. David fighting back, creating a diversion. He had pushed the USB into Rocky's collar, opened the door, and given his final command, "Find Barnes. Go." He had saved them, sacrificing himself so they could run. James looked at the small, silent boy who was now staring at the floor. "Carl," he began softly. Rachel's expression crumpled. "He saw it, James. He saw everything. He hasn't said a word since. Not one word." James felt the air leave his lungs. He understood that kind of silence. He understood the kind of trauma that steals your voice. He looked at this broken family, refugees from a war he didn't even know was being fought, and saw the echoes of his own shattered life. The quiet mountain had not been a sanctuary. It had only been a place to wait. And now, the war had come to find him. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, tense procession. James led the way, his rifle held in a low-ready position, his senses sweeping the forest around them. Behind him, Rachel followed, her hand resting on Carl's shoulder. The boy walked with the numb, shuffling steps of a sleepwalker, his eyes fixed on the ground. Bringing up the rear was Rocky, his movements stiff with pain, but his head constantly swiveling, scanning their back trail with a low, rumbling growl that vibrated deep in his chest. They were a company of the wounded, a small, broken unit retreating to the only defensible position they had. When they reached the cabin, James saw it through new eyes. For 6 years it had been a fortress of solitude, its sturdy log walls meant to keep the world out. Now it had to be a sanctuary, a place to keep the danger at bay. Inside, the warmth of the hearth greeted them. He saw Rachel visibly relax, the rigid lines of fear around her eyes softening just a fraction. She guided Carl to the worn armchair by the fire, and the boy sank into it, his small frame looking lost in the large piece of furniture. James put a fresh log on the fire, the crackle and pop a comforting sound in the heavy silence. "Get some rest," he told Rachel, his voice low. "You're safe here for now." But rest was a luxury none of them could afford. While Rachel made a simple meal from his supplies, James turned his attention to the object that had started it all, the small black USB drive. He retrieved an old ruggedized laptop from his footlocker. It was a relic, completely offline, a machine he kept for one purpose: to access digital information without connecting to any network. He powered it on, the screen glowing to life in the dim cabin. He inserted the drive. A single password-protected icon appeared on the screen. He clicked on it, and a simple dialog box materialized. Enter passphrase. For the next hour, James worked with a silent, focused frustration. He ran every basic decryption program in his old toolkit. He tried to bypass the security wall with backdoors he had learned in the service. He attempted to brute force the password with every combination of names, dates, and numbers he could associate with David Carson. The result was always the same: access denied. The encryption was military grade, a digital fortress as formidable as the mountain itself. The answers were all right there, a ghost in the machine, but he had no way to make it speak. He finally pushed the laptop away, leaning back in his chair and running a hand over his tired face. It was useless. Rachel approached, placing a steaming mug of coffee on the table beside him. She had watched him work, her expression a mixture of hope and dread. "Nothing?" she asked softly. "It's locked down tight," James admitted. "David didn't want anyone getting in. The problem is, that includes us." She sank into the chair opposite him, her hands wrapped around her own mug for warmth. He was so careful. He knew who he was dealing with. She looked up, her eyes dark with the memory. "His name is Victor Kane." James listened as she painted a portrait of their enemy. Victor Kane was not some back-alley crime lord. He was a celebrated tech billionaire, a charismatic philanthropist whose face was on the cover of magazines. He preached about connecting the world and building a better future, and the public adored him. But behind the curtain of his pristine public image, he was a predator. David had discovered that Kane's revolutionary logistics software, the program that ran his global shipping empire, had a hidden, darker purpose. It was the operational backbone for a sophisticated human trafficking network. "He's not just a criminal, James," Rachel said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "He's a sociopath. He's brilliant, charming, and utterly convinced that he is above any law." David said the most dangerous thing about him was his arrogance. He believes he is so much smarter than everyone else that he can hide his crimes in plain sight. James felt a chill run down his spine. It was a type of enemy he knew well, the true believer, utterly convinced of his own infallibility. "An army of one is still just one man," James said. "He doesn't do the dirty work himself." "No," Rachel whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "For that, he has Damon." She described the man who was Victor Kane's shadow. Damon was the leader of a small, brutally efficient team of mercenaries, all former Special Forces operators from various countries. They were Kane's personal fixers, the ones who cleaned up his messes and eliminated his problems. David said he was more than just a thug. He was a professional, a ghost. He never leaves a witness, never leaves a trace. He's disciplined, intelligent, and completely without a soul. He enjoys his work. She paused, wrapping her arms around herself as if fighting off a chill. David managed to get a source inside Kane's security team. The source gave him a name, a call sign they used for Damon. They called him Silas on the comms sometimes, after the fanatical monk in that old book. James froze. The coffee mug in his hand stopped halfway to his lips. Silas. The name echoed in the deepest, most haunted chamber of his mind. After the accident that had killed Sarah and Lily, the official police report had been thick and inconclusive. A multi-car pileup on a rain-slicked night, but one of the investigating state troopers, an old acquaintance, had pulled James aside weeks later. He had spoken in low, unofficial tones about inconsistencies, about a professional-grade driver who had caused the initial crash and then simply vanished from the scene, their vehicle never found. He had mentioned whispers he'd heard from federal contacts about a highly skilled fixer who sometimes used the call sign Silas. At the time, it had been a ghost story, a loose thread in a tapestry of grief and confusion. James had buried it along with everything else. Now, the ghost had a face. "James?" Rachel asked, seeing the color drain from his face. "What is it?" He looked at her, but he didn't truly see her. He saw the mangled wreckage on a dark highway. He saw the flashing red and blue lights painting the trees. He saw the face of the man who had taken everything from him, and he now knew that man had a name. The accident that had shattered his life had been no accident at all. It was a job, and Damon was the man who had done it. The war had not just come to find him, it had been with him all along. The name hung in the air between them, a venomous, invisible thing. Damon. For James Barnes, the world had just shrunk to the size of that single name. The vast, indifferent wilderness outside, the 6 years of self-imposed exile, the quiet, aching grief, it all collapsed into one sharp, terrifying point of focus. The man who had hunted David Carson was the same man who had shattered his own life. It was not a coincidence. It was a reckoning. Rachel saw the transformation in his eyes. The weary sadness she had seen earlier was gone, replaced by something colder, harder. It was a look she had seen once before, in the eyes of her husband when he spoke of the things he'd had to do in the war. It was the look of a man who had made peace with violence and was now calling it back to him like an old friend. Before either of them could speak again, the deciding sound came not from a man, but from the animal by the hearth. Rocky, who had been resting quietly, suddenly lifted his head. His ears swiveled, tuning to a frequency beyond human hearing. A low growl, like the first rumbling of an earthquake, vibrated deep in his chest. He rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion. the pain from his wound seemingly forgotten. He padded silently to the large window, his powerful body tensed, his gaze fixed not on the ground below, but on the sky above. "What is it?" Rachel whispered, her hand instinctively going to her son's shoulder. Carl remained asleep in the armchair, oblivious. James didn't answer. He trusted the dog's instincts implicitly. He grabbed the pair of high-powered binoculars from the mantelpiece and moved to stand beside Rocky, matching his line of sight. At first, he saw nothing but the vast, empty canvas of the afternoon sky, streaked with high, thin clouds. He scanned the horizon methodically, from left to right, his movements economical and precise. He swept past a lone hawk circling on a thermal. Nothing. He was about to lower the binoculars when he caught it. A flicker of unnatural movement. He focused the lenses, his knuckles white. There, high above the opposite ridge, was a tiny black speck. It wasn't a bird. It moved with the smooth, geometric precision of a machine, cutting a slow, deliberate grid pattern across the valley. A drone. A scout. "They've found us," James said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The time for grief was over. The time for reaction had begun. He turned from the window, and the grieving recluse was gone. In his place stood Sergeant Barnes of the United States Marine Corps. His movements became sharp, economical, each one with a clear purpose. "Rachel," he said, his tone calm and authoritative, commanding attention without raising his voice. "Listen to me carefully. I need you to take Carl into the back bedroom. There's a heavy oak dresser against the far wall. Help me move it in front of the window. Stay in that room and stay low. No matter what you hear, you do not come out until I tell you it's safe. Do you understand?" She stared at him, her fear palpable, but she saw the unwavering resolve in his eyes and nodded. "Yes." Together, they moved the heavy piece of furniture, blocking the bedroom's only window. He gave her a canteen of water and a loaded pistol. He showed her how to work the safety. "Only as a last resort," he instructed. She nodded again, her face pale, but her hands steady as she took the weapon. With Rachel and Carl secured, James began to turn his home into a fortress. He moved with a startling efficiency, a grim dance of preparation. He dragged the heavy wooden dining table and bolted it against the front door, reinforcing it. He locked down the main room's large windows with heavy storm shutters he'd built for the winter, leaving only tiny, horizontal slits, firing ports, that would allow him to see out without being seen. He went to the large footlocker at the end of his bed and opened it. He pulled out his rifle, a military-grade M4 carbine, and several magazines of ammunition. He checked the action, the familiar metallic click, a grimly satisfying sound in the quiet cabin. He laid the magazines out on the mantelpiece, within easy reach of the main window. He placed his own pistol on the small table by his armchair. He was a man preparing for a siege, not with panic, but with the methodical precision of a craftsman laying out his tools. Finally, when every physical preparation was complete, he retrieved the last tool. From the very bottom of the locker, wrapped in oilcloth, was an old satellite phone. It was a relic from a past life, a piece of gear he had never expected to use again. He took it out onto the porch, seeking a clear line of sight to the sky. Rocky followed, a silent gray and white shadow at his side. The dog sat at the edge of the porch, his gaze sweeping the tree line, a vigilant sentry. James powered on the phone, the electronic beep sounding alien in the natural silence. It took a moment to acquire a signal. He dialed a number from memory. It rang twice before a man's voice, calm and steady, answered. "Brody?" "Brody, Barnes here," James said, his voice low and even. He knew this call could be monitored. Sheriff Brody was a good man, a friend from before the accident. He was a stocky, gray-haired lawman who understood the value of leaving a man to his privacy. But James knew his loyalty was absolute. "James? It's been a while. Everything all right up there?" "There's a possibility of a bad snowstorm moving in," James said, the code words feeling strange on his tongue. "Could get loud up here." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Brody was sharp. He understood this was no weather report. "How bad are we talking?" "The kind that closes roads," James replied. "Listen, I sent you a set of coordinates a few years back for a new hunting blind. You still have them?" "Got them filed away," Brody confirmed, his voice now a little tighter. "Good. If you get a single-word text message from me, Avalanche, I need you to bring your best team to those coordinates. Come in from the East Ridge and come quiet. No lights, no sirens. And Brody, don't ask any questions over the radio." The silence on the other end was heavy with unspoken questions. But James knew his friend would trust him. "Understood, James," Brody said finally. "Stay safe." "You too," James said, and ended the call. He had planted the seed. He had laid out his contingency. It was all he could do. He looked out at the vast, beautiful, and dangerous wilderness surrounding him. The sun was beginning to dip below the peaks, painting the clouds in shades of orange and blood red. The first shadow had passed. Now, all they could do was wait for the darkness to come, and for the monsters that moved within it. Night fell, not with a gentle fade, but like a heavy black curtain dropped over the mountains. The world outside the cabin was reduced to sound and shadow. The whisper of the wind in the pines, the distant hoot of an owl, and the nervous rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. Inside, the silence was of a different kind. It was thick and heavy, charged with the electric tension of waiting. James Barnes stood by the main window, a motionless silhouette against the faint glow of the dying fire. He peered through the narrow slit in the shutters, his eyes scanning the moon-dappled darkness. Every nerve was alight, every sense tuned to the hostile quiet. He was a sentry on a wall, guarding the last outpost of a world that had shrunk to the space of a single room. Across the cabin, Rachel sat at the small table, her hands wrapped around a long, cold mug of coffee. She was trying to be strong, her back straight, her expression composed, but her knuckles were white, and her gaze kept flitting towards the barricaded door. She was a civilian caught in a soldier's war, and her fear was a palpable presence in the room. And in the large armchair, Carl remained a small, still island of trauma. He was curled into a tight ball, his face turned away from the room, his small shoulders rigid. He had not moved for hours, lost in a silent, colorless world that no one could enter. It was Rocky who broke the stalemate. The great dog had been lying near the hearth, a living, breathing shadow, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. He seemed to understand the heavy weight of the waiting. With a soft groan, he pushed himself to his feet. Ignoring his own pain, he padded silently across the floor, not to James at his post or to Rachel at the table, but to the armchair. He did not bark or whine or nudge. He simply lay down on the floor beside the chair, his body a solid, warm wall of fur and muscle. He rested his great head on his paws, facing the door as if to say, "I will watch over you." He offered no demands, only a steady, quiet presence. He was an anchor in a sea of fear. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, from the small figure in the chair, a tiny hand emerged. It hovered in the air for a moment, trembling slightly, before slowly descending. Carl's fingers gently, hesitantly, made contact with the thick fur on Rocky's back. The dog did not flinch. He let out a soft sigh, a puff of warm air, and leaned into the touch almost imperceptibly. James watched the scene from the corner of his eye, his own breathing hitched. It was the first voluntary movement he had seen the boy make, the first sign of a connection to the world outside his own silent prison.
Carl's hand began to move, stroking the dog's fur in a slow, rhythmic motion.
He uncurled himself slightly, leaning over the arm of the chair to get a better look at his new guardian. His eyes, so long vacant, now held a flicker of focus. They traced the lines of the dog's powerful body until they rested on the white bandages wrapped around his torso. He saw a small dark spot where a little blood had seeped through the dressing. The boy's expression shifted. The blankness was replaced by a look of deep, childlike concern. He slid out of the chair, his movements still tentative. He went to the small basin of water on the hearth, where Rachel had left a cloth. He picked up the cloth, dipped a corner into the cool water, and carefully wrung it out, his small hands mimicking an action he must have seen 100 times. He returned to Rocky's side. The dog watched him, his tail giving a single, slow thump against the floorboards. Carl knelt, and with a touch as gentle as falling snow, he began to dab at the stained bandage, cleaning the tiny spot of blood away. He was not just petting a dog. He was caring for a fellow patient. He was trying to fix something that was broken. James felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest, so intense it almost brought him to his knees. He turned fully from the window, the threat outside momentarily forgotten, and watched the silent boy gently tending to the wounded dog. The image was a key, unlocking a door in his memory that he had kept bolted shut for 6 years. He saw not Carl, but his own daughter, Lily. He saw her at age 6, her hands just as small, just as gentle, as she tried to put a bandage on the scraped knee of her favorite teddy bear. He remembered her boundless, innocent compassion, the way she would rescue earthworms from the hot pavement after a rainstorm, the soft humming sound she would make when she was concentrating on an act of kindness. He saw her spirit, her pure and gentle heart, living in the quiet, careful movements of this broken little boy. The ice that had encased his heart for 2,190 days began to crack. His grief, for so long a source of isolating, numbing pain, transformed. It was no longer just a ghost to be endured. It became a fire. This was not about revenge for a man named David Carson, a brother he had lost touch with. It was not even about settling a score with the phantom named Damon, who haunted his past. It was about the small, fragile flicker of life right here, right now, in his cabin. It was about this silent boy who was finding his way back to the world through an act of kindness. It was about this brave dog who had carried a message of hope through a storm of violence. It was about this terrified woman who was fighting to hold the pieces of her life together. He looked at Carl, carefully folding the cloth, his task complete. He looked at Rocky, who rested his head on the boy's lap in a gesture of absolute trust. He looked at Rachel, who watched her son with tears of sorrow and gratitude silently streaming down her face. A family. A broken, terrified, makeshift family, huddled together in his fortress of solitude. His reason for fighting was no longer behind him, buried in the cold ground of the past. It was here, now, breathing the same tense air he was. He was fighting to protect the future, a fragile and uncertain thing that was curled up by his fire. The hours after midnight were the darkest and the quietest. Inside the cabin, a fragile sense of normalcy had settled. Rachel had finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, her head resting on the table. In the armchair, Carl slept soundly for the first time in days, his small hand still resting on Rocky's back. The dog lay beside him, a vigilant, living blanket. Only James Barnes remained awake, a ghost at the window, his world compressed to the narrow, moonlit slice of forest visible through the shutter. The attack, when it came, did not start with a bang. It began with a whisper. Rocky's head lifted from his paws, a silent movement, that screamed alarm. The low rumble started deep in his chest, a sound of pure menace that was nothing like his earlier growls. His lips peeled back from his teeth, and the fur along his spine bristled. His gaze was locked on the dark expanse of trees to the northwest. James trusted the dog more than he trusted his own eyes. He raised his rifle, the night vision scope turning the world into a sea of ethereal green. He followed Rocky's line of sight, scanning the dense undergrowth. At first, he saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from another shadow. There were 3 of them, moving with the fluid, predatory grace of professionals. They were clad in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas. They carried short-barreled rifles with suppressors, the weapons held at the ready. They communicated with silent, efficient hand signals, fanning out to form a perimeter. This was Damon's team. They were not here to negotiate. James's heart hammered a slow, cold rhythm in his chest. He was outmanned, outgunned. But this was his mountain. He had the advantage of terrain and preparation. He let them come closer, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He watched as the point man moved past a large oak tree, his boot snagging on a thin, almost invisible wire. Clang, clang, clang! The sound of the string of empty tin cans rattling in the dead quiet night was as loud as a gunshot. The effect was immediate. The 3 figures froze, their training momentarily overridden by surprise. It was the opening James needed. He sighted on the lead figure and squeezed the trigger. His rifle, unlike theirs, was not suppressed. The crack of the shot was a deafening roar that shattered the silence, a declaration of war. The lead mercenary crumpled to the ground. The other 2 instantly returned fire, their suppressed weapons making sharp, angry foot sounds as bullets thudded into the thick log walls of the cabin. The siege had begun. "Rachel, get down," James yelled, his voice a commanding bark that cut through the noise. He dropped below the window as a hail of bullets stitched across the shutters. Wood splintered. In the back room, Rachel was instantly awake, pulling a terrified but still silent Carl from the chair and onto the floor behind the heavy oak dresser. James crawled on his belly to a second firing port on the opposite side of the room. The enemy was smart. While 2 men laid down covering fire on his last known position, a third was already flanking, trying to get an angle on the back of the cabin. But Rocky was ahead of them. The dog was now at the rear window, his barks sharp and furious, a living alarm system pointing James exactly where to look. James sighted through the rear slit. He saw the flanking mercenary just as he was about to dash from the cover of a granite boulder. James fired 2 quick shots. The man cried out and scrambled back behind the rock. His advance halted. The fight settled into a deadly rhythm. They were professionals, methodically testing his defenses, firing from different positions, trying to draw his attention and create an opening. But James was a master of defense. He moved constantly between his prepared positions, firing only 1 or 2 shots from each before relocating. He made it impossible for them to pinpoint his location, creating the illusion that they might be facing more than one defender. He was a ghost in his own home, his movements precise and deadly. Rocky was his second set of eyes and ears. The dog's senses were far superior to his own. A low growl to his left, and James would shift to cover the western approach. A sharp bark directed at the stone chimney, and James knew they were considering the roof. He and the dog worked in perfect, unspoken sync, a 2-man unit forged in the crucible of battle. 1 man's skill and training, 1 dog's loyalty and preternatural senses, holding back the tide of darkness. But he knew it couldn't last. They were patient. They would wear him down. They had more men, more ammunition. He saw more shadows moving at the edge of the woods, reinforcing the initial team. They were tightening the net. His contingency plan, his call to Brody, was his only true hope. But to make that call, he needed a window of opportunity, a few seconds of quiet in the middle of the storm. The opportunity came from an act of aggression. Two mercenaries coordinated a charge on the front porch, laying down a heavy curtain of fire to cover their advance. James was pinned down at a side window. He watched them get closer, readying himself for a close-quarters fight he was unlikely to win. Suddenly, Rocky, in a surge of protective fury, launched himself at the main window's shuttered opening, barking and snarling with such ferocity that the mercenaries hesitated for a split second, momentarily believing a second defender was stationed there. It was the break James needed. He scrambled away from his position, grabbing the satellite phone from his pack, which he had placed near the hearth. He dove behind the heavy overturned table as bullets ripped through the space he had just occupied. His fingers flew across the keypad, his training allowing him to operate by touch alone. He typed the single prearranged word, avalanche. He hit send. The screen flashed a confirmation. Message sent. Just as the confirmation appeared, a heavy round smashed through the shutter, showering him with splinters. The mercenaries were renewing their attack, their brief hesitation over. James dropped the phone and grabbed his rifle, rolling back into a firing position. The signal was sent. The request for aid was out. But help was miles and precious minutes away. The night was still long, and the enemy was at his door. The battle for the cabin, for their lives, was far from over. The silence that followed the first assault was more terrifying than the noise. It was a listening silence, a predator's pause. Outside, in the darkness, James Barnes knew the enemy was regrouping, assessing, and preparing to come again, harder this time. The air in the cabin was thick with the acrid smell of cordite and splintered pine. He moved quickly, reloading his magazines, his hands steady despite the adrenaline that coursed through his veins. Every second of this quiet was a gift, but he knew it was a gift that would soon be taken away. They were trapped. The message was sent, but the mountain was vast, and help was far away. If they didn't survive until Brody's team arrived, their deaths would be just another mystery, another tragedy swallowed by the wilderness. The proof, the entire reason for David's sacrifice, remained locked away on the small piece of plastic and metal on the table. Frustration and despair began to eat at the edges of his control. He stared at the encrypted USB drive with a feeling of utter helplessness. Rachel sat on the floor in the back room, holding her sleeping son. The terror of the attack had subsided into a state of numb, hopeless dread. Her mind, seeking an escape, drifted back to the last good day she'd had with David, just before he left on his final trip. They had been walking by the river near their home. He had been quiet, his mind clearly elsewhere. She had asked him what was wrong. He had just held her close and said something strange, something she had dismissed at the time as poetic nonsense. Now, in the suffocating quiet of the besieged cabin, the words came back to her with a sudden, startling clarity. "If anything happens," she whispered, the words barely audible. "If the worst comes, remember Sarah's lullaby on the river." James, who was checking the barricade on the front door, froze. He turned slowly, his gray eyes locking onto hers. To her, it was a fragment of a memory, a husband's cryptic goodbye. To James, it was a key. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "It's just something David said," she stammered, confused by his reaction. "It doesn't mean anything." "Say it again, exactly as he said it." "He said, 'Remember Sarah's lullaby on the river.'" James stared at her, his mind racing, connecting dots that had been invisible moments before. It wasn't a romantic phrase. It was a fail-safe. It was a password protocol, designed by one Marine for another. A code built not on algorithms, but on shared history and unbreakable trust. Sarah. his wife's name. A lullaby, a song, a simple melody. The river, a location. That's it, he breathed, a surge of adrenaline hitting him, this time born not of fear, but of hope. He grabbed the laptop from the floor. That's the key. He sat at the table, his movements urgent. Rachel came to stand behind him, her eyes wide with a dawning, fragile hope. He inserted the USB drive again, the familiar password prompt appearing on the screen. David knew your wife's name was Sarah, Rachel said, understanding beginning to piece itself together. He was the best man at our wedding, James confirmed, his focus entirely on the screen. He typed the first part of the key, S-A-R-A-H. The river, he murmured, his mind casting back through the years. There were 100 rivers, 1,000 memories, but only one that mattered. The French Broad River, a specific bend in the water just outside of Asheville, where he and Sarah had gone on their first real date in the summer of 1998. A place so significant to them that David was the only other person on Earth who knew its story. He pulled up an offline topographical map he had saved on his hard drive. His fingers moved quickly over the trackpad, zooming in, his memory guiding him with perfect precision. He found the spot. He read the grid coordinates, a long string of numbers. He returned to the password prompt. After Sarah, he carefully typed the numbers, 35.5956, negative 82.5515. His finger hovered over the enter key. This was it. The entire war, David's death, their survival, all of it came down to this single, desperate guess, built on a foundation of memory and loss. He pressed the key. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the password box vanished. A single folder icon appeared on the screen, labeled INSURANCE. A choked sob escaped Rachel's lips. James felt a wave of dizzying relief, but it was instantly followed by a cold dread. They had unlocked the door. Now they had to face what was inside. He clicked on the folder. It was filled with dozens of meticulously organized files. Spreadsheets detailed offshore bank accounts. Encrypted documents outlined shipping routes. Audio files contained secretly recorded conversations. It was Victor Kane's entire criminal empire, a monument to greed and cruelty. But one file had a simple, chilling name, the date of David's death. It was a video file. With a deep breath, James double-clicked it. The screen filled with the familiar, slightly distorted view from a car's dash cam. It was David's car. They were watching the last moments of his life. They saw a peaceful country road, the sun filtering through the trees. Then a black SUV pulling out aggressively, blocking the way. David's surprised curse. Then the driver's side door of the SUV opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in tactical gear, and moved with an efficient, predatory confidence. It was Damon. The video was high definition, his face clear and unmistakable in the afternoon light. He raised his rifle. The screen flashed with the muzzle blast, the sound, a deafening crack. The view from the camera slumped sideways as David was thrown against the passenger seat. The video ended. A profound, horrified silence filled the cabin. Rachel was weeping, her hands covering her mouth, her body shaking with a grief so raw it was painful to witness. But it was the small, silent figure in the corner who provided the final, damning testimony. Carl, awakened by the sound of his mother's cries, had padded out from the back room. He had been drawn by the flickering light of the laptop. He had seen the last few seconds of the video. He had seen the face of the man. The boy made a sound, the first he had made in 2 days. It was a choked, strangled gasp, a sound of pure terror. He recoiled as if he had been physically struck, his body trembling violently. He stared at the frozen image of Damon on the screen, his eyes wide with a recognition that went beyond simple fear. It was the absolute certainty of a witness. He lifted a small, shaking hand and pointed a finger at the face of his father's killer. He didn't need to say a word. His silence screamed the truth. Outside in the cold mountain darkness, Damon was losing his patience. This was supposed to be a simple surgical cleanup. One man, a woman, and a child. But the solitary man in the cabin fought with the skill and tenacity of an entire fire team. They were professionals, equipped with superior numbers and technology. Yet they were being held at bay by a ghost on a mountain. The prolonged failure was an insult to Damon's arrogance. "Enough of this," he snarled into his comms unit. "All teams, suppress the main cabin. Rhino, breach the west wall on my signal. We're going in. I'll handle the target myself." The assault, when it came, was an act of pure, overwhelming force. A deafening barrage of automatic fire erupted from the tree line, hammering the cabin from all sides, forcing James to take cover. Under the curtain of noise and splintering wood, two of Damon's men, one a mountain of a man he had called Rhino, sprinted from the darkness, carrying a small, powerful breaching charge. They slapped it against the log wall near a window that had been shattered in the initial attack. The explosion was a brutal, concussive blast that ripped a jagged hole in the side of the cabin. Smoke and dust filled the room. Before the echoes had even faded, two figures in black tactical gear poured through the opening. James met them head-on. The fight was no longer a long-distance duel. It was a desperate, close-quarters brawl. He engaged the first mercenary, his rifle now useless in the confined space. The fight was a blur of motion, a brutal dance of blocks, strikes, and grapples. But in the chaos, his focus was singular: Damon. The mercenary leader entered through the breach, his movements cool and deliberate amidst the violence. He dispatched the second man from his team with a sharp, curt order to secure the back room. Then, he turned his full attention to James. The two men circled each other in the smoky, firelit room. Two apex predators meeting for the first time. "You're good," Damon said. His voice a low, calm growl that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "But you're just one man." They collided. It was a fight of savage efficiency. Every blow was thrown with intent to maim or disable. James fought with the desperate strength of a man defending his home and the last flicker of hope in his life. Damon fought with the cold, detached skill of a man for whom violence was simply a tool of his trade. They crashed into furniture. The sounds of their struggle, grunts of pain, the sickening thud of fists on flesh, filling the small cabin. Slowly, inevitably, Damon's superior strength and uninjured state began to win out. He was a machine, relentless and tireless. He caught James with a vicious blow to the ribs that sent him stumbling back. Damon followed, tackling him to the ground. The air was driven from James's lungs. He saw stars. A combat knife appeared in Damon's hand, the blade gleaming in the firelight. Damon straddled his chest, pressing the point of the knife against his throat. "You've been a problem, Barnes," Damon sneered, his face inches from James's. He had been briefed. He knew who lived here. A cruel, knowing smile spread across his lips. "But you're not the first problem in this family I've had to solve." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a final venomous taunt. "Your wife, she screamed. Your daughter didn't even make a sound. It was just a quick little bump on the highway, an accident." The words were meant to break him, to shatter his will in the final moments. But they were not the last words spoken in the cabin. From the doorway of the back room, a sound erupted, a sound of pure primal fury that no one could have expected. It was the sound of a voice, stolen by trauma, being ripped back into the world. "Leave him alone!" It was Carl. The boy stood there, his small body trembling. his face pale and tear-streaked. He was staring at Damon, at the monster from his nightmares, and for the first time he was not silent. The shout was a grenade of sound in the tense, violent silence. It shocked James, a jolt of pure, protective adrenaline surging through him. But its effect on Damon was even more profound. He was a professional who controlled every variable, and a screaming child was a variable he had not anticipated. For one critical, fatal second, his concentration broke. His head turned instinctively toward the source of the sound, his eyes widening in surprise. That second was all James needed. With a roar that came from the deepest part of his soul, he exploded upward. He deflected the knife, the sharp edge slicing a shallow line across his arm. He used Damon's own weight and momentum against him, bucking his hips and rolling them over. The positions were reversed. James was now on top, his hands locked around Damon's throat. All his grief, his rage, his love for the family he had lost and the family he was now protecting, channeled into one final, desperate act of survival. Just as he gained control, the world outside the cabin erupted in a flurry of silent, coordinated motion. The remaining mercenaries in the woods were suddenly neutralized, taken down by dark figures that seemed to rise from the very earth. The front door, weakened by the battle, was kicked in. Sheriff Brody stood there, a shotgun in his hands, flanked by a team of SWAT officers in full tactical gear. They had come from the east. They had come in silence. They had followed the plan. They swarmed the cabin, their movements professional and swift. The mercenary who had gone to the back room was subdued instantly. Brody took in the scene, the battered and bleeding James pinning a defeated Damon to the floor, and his expression was a mask of grim understanding. The siege was over. The final battle had been won. From the back room, the sound of a child's voice, no longer screaming in terror, but now crying with relief, echoed through the quiet cabin. The chaos of the final battle gave way to the controlled, quiet efficiency of law enforcement. The cabin, which had been a battlefield moments before, was now a swarm of deputies and paramedics. The air, thick with the scent of gunpowder, was now cut with the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic. James Barnes sat on the edge of his porch, a paramedic carefully stitching the knife wound on his arm. He barely felt the sting of the needle. His gaze was fixed on the scene unfolding before him. Damon and his surviving men, their faces grim and defeated, were being led away in handcuffs. Their war was over. Sheriff Brody walked over, his expression a mixture of relief and awe. He held the small black USB drive in his gloved hand as if it were a holy relic. "The things my tech guy is pulling off this drive, James." Brody shook his head. "It's bigger than we ever could have imagined." David Carson. He was a hero. James nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He looked over at Rachel, who was sitting in an ambulance, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Carl was beside her, his small hand buried deep in the thick fur of Rocky's neck. The dog stood like a granite statue, a silent, loyal guardian watching over his boy. In that moment, James handed the drive, the evidence, and the burden of justice to his friend. His part of the fight was over. Now, the healing had to begin. The fall of Victor Kane's empire was swift and spectacular. The evidence on the USB drive, which the media quickly dubbed the Carson Key, was a digital bombshell. It provided an undeniable roadmap of Kane's entire criminal network. Faced with an ironclad case and the prospect of spending the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, Damon broke his code of silence. He confessed to everything, detailing years of Kane's dirty work, including the meticulously planned accident on a rainy night in 2019 that had taken the lives of a lawyer named Sarah Barnes and her young daughter. The news stories were a firestorm. The philanthropist was revealed to be a monster. The tech mogul was a human trafficker. The name Victor Kane became synonymous with evil. and the name David Carson was finally celebrated for the hero he was. But for the survivors on the mountain, the headlines were just distant noise. Their world was the quiet, difficult work of rebuilding. The cabin, once a place of violence, slowly transformed. Rachel, with a quiet strength that amazed James every day, began to reclaim the space. She cleaned the splintered wood, scrubbed the floors, and let the sunlight back into the rooms. She insisted on cooking, and the smell of fresh bread soon replaced the lingering scent of battle. Carl's recovery was a slow, delicate process. His voice, ripped from him by a scream of terror, did not return overnight. But his silence was no longer vacant. His eyes began to lose their haunted look. His constant companion was Rocky. The great dog seemed to understand that the boy's healing was now his primary mission. He was gentle, patient, and always there. Carl would spend hours sitting with the dog, his small hands methodically brushing Rocky's thick gray and white coat. His first words, which came a few weeks later, were not for James or his mother. They were for the dog. One afternoon, as he threw a pine cone for Rocky to fetch, a small, clear voice broke the silence. "Good boy, Rocky." Rachel wept at the sound, and James felt a warmth spread through his chest that he had not felt in years. From then on, the words came more easily, like a river slowly thawing in the spring. One clear, cold morning in November, James did something he hadn't done since he first came to the mountains. He drove down into the valley, to the small cemetery just outside of town. Rocky sat in the passenger seat, his head resting on the center console, a silent, supportive presence. He stood before the two simple granite headstones. Sarah Barnes, Lily Barnes. For 6 years, this place had been a monument to his failure, his guilt, and his rage. He had been unable to face it. But today was different. He knelt and traced the letters of their names with his fingertips. He told them everything. He told them about David and Rachel, and a brave little boy named Carl. He told them about a loyal dog who had brought a war to his doorstep, and in doing so, had shown him the way back to life. He told them that the man responsible for their deaths was finally facing justice. "I'm sorry it took so long," he whispered, the wind carrying his words away. "I hope you can rest now." And as he stood there, a profound sense of peace settled over him. The ghosts were gone. They had not been vanquished in a blaze of vengeful glory, but had simply faded away, replaced by the warmth of a new purpose, a new family. The story ends 5 months later, in the heart of a gentle spring. The Blue Ridge Mountains were bursting with new life, the slopes painted with the vibrant greens of new leaves and the soft pastels of wildflowers. The cabin was no longer a fortress. It was a home. A small garden, lovingly tended by Rachel, grew in a patch of sunlight near the porch. The sound of a child's laughter, clear and bright, echoed in the yard. Carl, his face alight with joy, threw a worn tennis ball for Rocky, who bounded after it with the happy abandon of a dog who knew his work was done. James Barnes sat on the porch swing, a mug of coffee in his hands. The weariness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady contentment. He watched Rachel walk over to Carl, ruffling his hair. He watched Rocky drop the ball at the boy's feet, his tail wagging in a triumphant arc. Rachel looked up at him and smiled, a real, unguarded smile that made his heart feel whole. He smiled back. He was no longer a ghost haunting a mountain. He was a man on a porch, watching his family. He was a husband. He was a father. He was home. The four of them, a family forged in tragedy and bound by loyalty, sat together on the porch as the sun began to set, its golden light bathing the peaceful peaks in a warm, promising glow. A new dawn had finally come. It is often said that time heals all wounds, but sometimes Healing doesn't come from the passing of seasons. It arrives on 4 paws, with a loyalty that asks for nothing, but gives everything, reminding us that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we fight to protect. If the story of James and Rocky touched your heart, we would be so grateful if you would share it with others. Your likes and comments mean the world to us and help our community grow. Please consider subscribing to hear more tales of courage, and continue the journey with us by clicking on the new story now appearing on your screen.